in today's session. So I'd like to welcome Lucy Moore, who has come to present with us today. I spoke to Lucy earlier in the week, and she's written an article on LinkedIn, and as she described it, was a bit of a mind dump in the middle of the night to get some thoughts about female coaching down. As you might have also seen, Bobby recorded a session with Amy Hardwick, which is one of our young coaches within England, and got her viewpoint and experience from female coaches. And over this week, I've spoke to some of our experienced female coaches that have achieved a lot in the sport to bring that perspective to you guys as well. Lucy, would you be able to unmute and give us a bit of a background of your coaching and then a background of where you are in your professional career and how that links to coaching, really? And where this article came from.
That's fine. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining in. So my coaching life, I'm a hockey coach. Hockey's my sport, and I said to Miriam when we spoke, if you met 7-year-old Lucy, she'd be very similar, always bossing and organising my friends around doing coaching. I feel like it's something that's part of who you are, and so hockey's my sport, and I've been for a long time involved as a coach and a coach developer. I coached in the Performance Centre for GB and England Hockey. And in my professional life, I'm lucky enough to also work full-time in sport and physical activity. So I'm head of professional workforce at Sport England, and I've been there for 2.5 years now, but was working more in the talent space, looking at coaches and coach development there. And prior to that, worked for hockey for a time and for football before that, and started life as a school sports coordinator and a PE teacher. So sports coaching, both in personal life, volunteer life, and work life, all at the same time. That's my background.
Great. And I guess just to add a bit of context, I'll add in, I guess, what my role is and my experience of coaching, which might help the viewers. So I did a degree that encompassed sports coaching and coached a lot as a youngster. And then I worked at London 2012 and took a bit of a different career path, and then got back into a coaching role throughout NGBs, and I've done that ever since. And as I discussed with Lucy, I took a different coaching role and took back and supported my husband through that journey, and looked after lots of athletes that are in the performance pathway and help them without directly coaching them, but helping with their life skills and things like that. So that's where I am. I've also completed a level 4 in elite coaching practice. So that just gives you a bit of my background and where I've come as a female coach, and heading more back into coaching more and more in the practical side as much as I can post the pandemic. I guess your article you wrote, Lucy, was really insightful and touched on loads of different areas within developing female coaching. There is some amazing stats out there that you quoted, and in some of the articles that you linked, looking at London and Rio Olympics, there's still only 11% of female coaches participating. Lots of coaches are coaching potentially at the lower end, and I think UK Coaching published something that 73% of sports coaches in 2017 were male, and that really paints the picture of female coaching. And watching Amy Hardwick's presentation to Bobby, lots of things that are touched on there are confidence and the barriers and how we can overcome them. But definitely from the conversations we've had is, that's not always the case for female coaches, and confidence isn't always the barrier. And we want to look at the different ways throughout this session about those areas and how we can combat them. So I guess a good way to look at it, in your current role, previous role, experience as a coach, what are some of the success stories you've been part of or witnessed for female coaches, and what made them successful, and how did those coaches deem success? That might not always be that it's a talent thing, but what success to a female coach, and what were their stories really?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that we are trying to treat women as coaches as a social issue, not just an individual issue. So thinking about it in the round, so for some people there might be individual personal barriers, feelings, lack of confidence, imposter syndrome that might prevent them from wanting to take this next step. But what makes me curious is more around what are the environmental factors that are meaning that women aren't putting themselves forward. So you mentioned some stats. Interestingly, when UK Coaching did a coaching population survey, they found that almost half of the coaching that people receive is carried out by women. Yet when you look at the amount of women that actually go on to have a qualification or call themselves a coach, that's where you come into what you described, as it goes down to about 30%. And as you start getting into the talent pathway space and into performance, it gets even worse. So there's something about women are interested in helping people, and women are interested in being involved in environments. But for whatever reason, whether that's within themselves or within the environments that they might operate in, they don't seem to be moving. They don't seem to be going towards a different environment. They don't seem to be progressing through the talent pathway, or the courses and workshops and formal development are not appealing to them. And so when we start to think about what's been successful, often the programs have involved a bit of everything. So there's a bit of mentoring and being able to see people like you further up the pathway or in different environments. There's been a bit around flexible approaches to learning, so moving things to online delivery, thinking about the content of courses and making those environments practical and supportive, and who delivers those learning experiences, how do you market them. And there's also been something about sponsorship, not just mentoring, but sponsorship. So the idea that when you talk to successful female coaches, there's typically been someone or some people along their journey who've believed in them, and they've had faith in them, and they've invited them to come to something or be part of something or assist something, or really championed them to go for a job or whatever, and they've helped to smooth that path and break down any barriers. So those, I guess, would be key highlighting principles that all the stories, as you start to talk to women who have been successful in coaching, whatever that means for them. So it doesn't necessarily mean going to the Olympics. It could be being really successful at community level, but allowing them to flourish as a person and as a coach, that they would probably be common themes that you'd see throughout all the stories.
Perfect. And I guess pulling on some of what Amy said, obviously she was a player in the sport, so you automatically have those connections potentially that where someone can sponsor you and push you forward, and that is a thread that runs through a lot of female coaching. They don't just turn up in a sport and then it happen. I guess for female coaches that maybe aren't part of handball or any sport, what would your advice be to them to start that journey and allow that environment to be there? Because it might not be organic in that sense for everyone.
Yeah, so I think there's different pathways depending on whether you are a former athlete or a participant versus somebody who's getting into a sport or an activity and wants to help other people to grow. I think there's an interesting stat, and it probably goes into bigger societal conversations about women as when they apply for roles being more worried about meeting every competency on the job spec and wanting to do things well. And I think for a lot of people, not just women, particularly when you're in a role or you're going for a job which has got other people are depending on you, you don't want to give a bad experience for a participant or an athlete, that you would perhaps worry that you're not going to be good enough. And I guess for people starting out, I think my biggest advice would be to try and take on the work without thinking you have to take on the world. To do what you feel comfortable doing, but also try and be a bit bold and not worry that you're going to do it wrong, because there is no right way of doing it. And it feeds into this wider conversation about what is good coaching and how do we define coaching, and moving away perhaps from the traditional view of coaching, sports coaching, where the coach is the expert and knows everything and the knowledge comes from the coach to the participant, to this more almost like executive coaching style of coaching, where it's a partnership, we're learning together and I'm helping you to learn and I have got some knowledge and some expertise, but actually really it's about you. And if we can start to reframe the conversation about what great coaching is at all levels, that I think that might be more appealing to to a lot of women, because actually what you're doing is a slightly different job. You don't have to be technical expert.
No, yeah, definitely. And I guess that leads on to some of the discussions we've had and I've had in this week, and the word bold is interesting. I think speaking to some coaches in the handball community, some of them have been bold, and that they may feel it went against them, so they put themselves out there and wanted to be bold and go for positions that they felt they had and maybe didn't get them for a multitude of reasons. And I guess just would love to get your view on, if someone is bold and it doesn't pull off as a woman,
yeah,
or a female coach, how do we change that? And how can we change that narrative that some women will put themselves out there and they will be confident and they won't have the barriers that typically we would say and see? What advice would you give to them? Because we always look at that barriers and not what the strengths are, and people that will put themselves out there and be extrovert.
Yeah, so much in what you said there. So firstly, there's loads of really interesting research about how women and men exhibiting the same character traits are perceived differently. So someone being quite assertive, if they are male, it's seen in a different way to a woman who might be seen as aggressive. Very interesting. Like, you can go down a right research rabbit warren if you want to look into that kind of stuff. I think really, as you can only control what you can control in yourself, and I think it's an interesting thing that we don't talk about coaches and coach development, coach learning, like we would do athletes or participants getting better. So we know that a participant or an athlete is going to at some point try for something and mess it up. They're going to, whether that's within a competition, a training session, or whether that's bigger, they're going to go for selection, they're not going to get picked. And thinking about the advice that you would offer to an athlete around that, well, you'd do some reflection, you'd think about you, and then you would try and get some feedback from as many people as possible, and you could go away and you could work on it. So you can only really manage yourself and your own responses. I think bigger from an organizational perspective, we need to have a conversation about how do we reward people for being brave and having a go, and look at how we develop strengths. And that's more of a, whether that's within a club or whether that's within an NGB, but rather than just rejecting people when they've had a go at something, let's really give them honest feedback. And that could be quite difficult, because that could be giving them feedback about something around who they are or the way they are. But let's have those really honest conversations, and then let's work together to see how those skills can get developed. I think sometimes when we turn people down for positions, and I mean this we in the global sense, because we're quite nice human beings, we think, oh, I don't really want to give that negative because that's going to land badly. And actually, so we skirt around the issues, whereas sometimes you need, particularly in coaching where it's a relationship thing, sometimes people need to hear that they need to go away and work on their communication style, or something like, which is going to land badly. That's going to be tough to hear, but that's the only way they'll get better. So I think there's something we can do as individual women and coaches when we get a knockback, and being more compassionate to ourselves. But there's also something we can do in the macro sense as clubs or organizations or people making these decisions, to think about how do we bring in different voices, how do we keep hold of people who are bold enough to put themselves forward in the same place, and have a bit more compassion there as well.
Yeah, and I think that comes to some bits you touched on in your article about that support network and feeling safe and being able to have at least one touch point with someone within the club or the system that you're working within, to be able to be vulnerable, to explain the issues, and then be supportive in that right way. And they might need to understand your private life and the journey you've come on for why you exhibit X, Y, and Z in that scenario, and where the passion comes from. I guess moving on from that, you mentioned in the article about media and the impact the media has, and I guess that links to what we discussed previously. You know, if a female coach was there on the sideline shouting, that probably would be highlighted against a male, just because they're not the traits we attach. And you know, Andy Murray is something that you looked at within what you wrote, and that's a great example of where he had a female coach and looked people looked upon that as different and not what you would generally see. And because he didn't win a Grand Slam in that season, that defines success. I guess my question to you is, how would you think the media needs to portray that when somebody of his stature takes that risk, and what recognition should we be trying to give coaches, female coaches at all levels, to get that recognition for what they're actually achieving? You know, she achieved a lot, you know, being his coach, but it was looked at in a very different sense of, you know, she was a female coach and he didn't achieve X, Y, and Z, and how we need to shape the media and institutions, organisations to present that differently, even if they didn't hit the ultimate success, but achieved a hell of a lot.
Yeah, so there's a lot in there. So an interesting thing, I don't know what it's like in handball, but in a number of sports and a number of coaches I've spoken to, and tennis would be an example of this. There is a real culture of, it's okay for women to coach boys up to like a certain level. So while the role is like nurturing under 12s, under 14s, whatever, that feels okay. But there's a real thing about once you get into sort of like a performance space, the women coaching men is seen as very strange, like very unusual in itself, just culturally, that you might be more okay having a female coach with a women's high performance or talent team, but not so much with the men's. I don't know how that lives in handball. So that in itself is an interesting cultural context. And then you talk about the media, and actually we were having a conversation with UK Sport about can we sort of pool our resources of what pictures of coaches and coaching do we have. And actually, even if you go out and ask women coaches to submit pictures of themselves coaching, they're very few and far between. I'm really pleased you've got one on your slide, but actually the bank collectively having a bank of pictures, good pictures of women in the act of coaching at all levels of the pathway outside of exercise and fitness is very few and far between. And that is something that we as funding organisations should be and will be commissioning, to get these pictures, because actually if you ask individual women, they say, oh no, I never have pictures taken of me coaching. So it's really interesting that there's this lack of like visibility, and that almost feeds into the idea that there are no women coaching. And there are women coaching, there are women doing a really good job of coaching, but we're not very good at taking pictures and showcasing them. And that was, you know, like part of what you were describing there is actually, of the people who are out there doing it, how do we make more of what they're doing and why it's good? And actually the attention is not so much on who Andy Murray's coach is, but what she has done and how she has done it. So yes, he didn't win that Grand Slam at that particular time, but actually let's highlight the good coaching qualities that she is exhibiting and what she has achieved, but let's not attribute that to the fact that she's a woman. So let's just start showcasing women coaches, because they are really, really good coaches. And actually the talking point no longer be, oh, she's a woman. Can we just start to showcase really great coaching, and it happens to be that person is female? I don't know. It's big and bold, and I don't think we're there yet, because we don't even have a decent collection of people coaching. So if anybody on the call has got pictures of themselves or others that are good coaching, and please, I would be very, very much appreciative of having them, because it's just, it's a gap.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think within handball we've got some very successful female coaches, and it's about how we showcase them in the right way, and it not be that token. So if they are coaching a men's team or a boys team, how do we promote them that the success was amazing, whether gender plays a part or not? They've achieved a lot, and especially when we look at research that female coaches generally coach female participants, and actually to have that success with an older age category of male or boys is an even bigger success, and we need to really flag that in some way. And I totally agree, it's a whole change in infrastructure about how we present that, but I'm very conscious that we don't do it as much as we need to, but also it doesn't want to be that token gesture, oh, we're doing it because you're a female, that comes across, and I think that's really important. I think moving on, earlier you mentioned about learning opportunities, and Amy mentioned it in her conversation with Bobby about how she's gone through a very formal journey, and I guess that's how a lot of coaches come. You go to university, you do your coaching levels, and then you get experiences, and you may be lucky enough to pick up a mentor that can take you through. Obviously, historically, lots of female coaches are coaching without formal qualifications, but have a heap of experience and have had guidance. I guess, how do you see it as a whole, I guess, through your current role within Sport England, how systems can support females and not making them go through a certain set pathway, and how do we start to recognise skill sets in an easier form than it having to be a formal learning experience to then allow either NGB jobs within coaching or clubs to recruit and look past, the typical job description, you need X, Y, and Z, really.
Yeah, so the big thing for me, and something I'm talking about a lot of work, and again, appreciate thoughts, comments on it, is trying to focus on the person rather than the role. So who is it who is the person that we want with these athletes? What do they need to know? How do they need to be? What do they need to believe in? What is their approach? What skills do they need to have? And starting with designing a person based on that kind of blend of characteristics and skills and behaviors. So there's an interesting leadership model that a guy called Sean Cote uses, a coach leadership model, and it has 3 circles: intrapersonal knowledge, interpersonal knowledge, and professional knowledge. So knowledge about yourself, who you are, what makes you tick, why do you act the way you act, what are your values, how does that impact your professional practice, how do you feel, all of that kind of stuff. Who are you? And then there's knowledge of interpersonal. So can you communicate? What's your body language? Do you understand others? Can you connect with people who are different to you? How do you do that? So that's interpersonal knowledge. How do you understand others? And then there's this thing about professional knowledge. So do you understand coaching? Do you understand how people learn? Do you know the theory and things behind that? Do you understand handball? So there's almost 2 bits of professional knowledge. One, the professional knowledge around being a coach generally. The other one about specifics of what you're actually there to do. So are you coaching kids? Are you coaching adults? More specific stuff. And actually, when you look at what we typically select people on and we train people on, it all kind of falls within that professional knowledge. And actually what I'm interested in, how do we look for people, and how do we talent spot in terms of coaches based on how self-aware are they? Do they understand themselves? Can they regulate themselves? What are their interpersonal skills and behaviors that they bring? And also, which is where it's really tricky, but how do we go about starting to develop those in people? So if you have somebody who's turning up at your door and they are really hot on the professional knowledge, they know handball and they know coaching, but they haven't got quite that intrapersonal skills and connections, how do we support that person to grow that bit? And which bits of this diagram are easier or harder to develop when we're talking about adults? So if you're 35, 40, 50, 60, how much of this is malleable? And we go to the professional knowledge because that is the easiest. It's the easiest to talk about, it's the easiest to point at, and it's the easiest to provide resources on. It's much harder to get people to do that kind of deep inner reflection about who are they, what motivates them, why did they respond that way in that situation, why does that particular athlete really trigger them and make them feel cross. That's kind of a very deep place to go to in terms of coach learning and coach development. So that's an interesting space that I'm definitely looking at the moment. I think that would be an interesting place for me to go. And then you could start to think about how do you deliver this kind of learning and what format does that take? So transmitting information, for example, like this via a webinar, will land well with some people and it will land less well with others. When you get into more discursive formats or practical things, people prefer that. So once you've decided what it is that we're actually trying to achieve and why we're trying to achieve this to help that person be a better coach, then you can start to go to how do we deliver it. Whereas I think historically we've started with the how we're going to deliver it. We're going to put on a workshop, and then we haven't actually got to the why, because we haven't had a clear idea of what we were trying to get to in the end. So I would sort of encourage anybody, whether it's in a club setting for development or an NGB or whatever, to think about really focusing on why, what's the end game, what we're actually trying to get to here, and then work your way back to the how. And you might come up with, well, let's do a webinar. But rather than start with, we're going to do some webinars and then worry about why, do it the other way around. Hopefully that made some sense.
No, yeah, perfect. I guess the feeling, I will imagine clubs will look at it, that's the right way to do it, but it's difficult to see those characteristics, and that the easy way to do it is, do you have a qualification, yes or no? And I guess where maybe not even just for females and males to get where they need to go is offering that opportunity to come and deliver, so that clubs can actually see them deliver and what they stand for, and get to know them as a person, to make sure that the coach fits the role that's been advertised, and vice versa, other than ticking the box, because clubs may miss female coaches that are more relevant to the role if they met them and understood their story and their journey, and where their philosophy was at. Whereas a 2D document that you fill in and send in doesn't really potentially represent you. And I sometimes wonder that we're not going to change that dial quickly, but female coaches that are really passionate maybe look at a different way of applying, whether that is offering to come and see people, or submitting a video blog of themselves, vlog of who they are and what they stand for people to start to understand them. And I think the sporting arena is changing within coaching, as you will be aware, and we are trying to change that dial of how to make it accessible, to access more formal learning, and us look at recognise prior learning of different elements, so that they can come in at different points. And I definitely think that's changing. But I think a lot of women that have lots going on and are very busy, if you look at it in the typical characteristics, the question will be why do they need to come to this formal workshop or this informal workshop? What will I gain from it? And why are they doing it? And I guess we need to look internally of why we're putting it on, when we're putting it on, how we market it, and what it'll give to female coaches. And I think that's really essential, and that piece post that informal or formal learning for people to then still connect with that deliverer or other people in their local area to continue that development moving forward. And I think that nicely ties into some of what Amy discussed and you've discussed about role models. I think there's lots of role models out there, and I get the feeling that sometimes we are not promoting female role models where they need to be, and allowing them to be accessible within our sport. And that might be that female coaches don't want to approach people, whether it's female or male, to ask for that support, because they might have competing clubs and agendas. And I guess from your coaching experience, what your advice would be about trying to seek out a mentor, and how to put that into place if a female coach would like that, and how to pick that mentor in the correct way to help you develop as much as you can. Because the easiest solution may be to go to a talent coach that is on a platform, but that might not always be the right avenue for a female coach and where they want to develop.
Yeah, so there's so much in there. I would probably start, you have to know yourself. Like, this is where the intro bit of the whole model, coach leading yourself, know yourself, what are your development areas, and trying to look for people, whether that's within your sport or outside, that have got that or have developed that, have worked on those kind of areas, and where do you get inspiration that actually, for some people, yes, it might be looking for more technical expertise or a different context, but not necessarily. there's also something in what you said about the power of networks and connections, and that's something that women are typically not as good at. And then when you come full circle back to the recruitment decisions and everything else, the power of pre-existing networks in terms of people getting jobs. So there's something about you as an individual knowing your network and almost mapping who's around you and where are they. And it could be an interesting exercise for coaches to do, is to sort of put yourself in the middle and then look at who are your immediate connections, who are you influenced by, who do you have those connections to, and to see what you see. So it may well be that they all end up being very, very similar people, so you need to go find some people with some slightly different opinions, or maybe they're all from one club, or maybe one country, or one style of play, or maybe, you know, you'll see whatever you see in your map. But that is an interesting thing of who are your influences in your immediate sphere and who do you have good connections with, and then thinking about how does that relate to where you want to go in your coaching career, your coaching profession, and where do you want to end up. So there's a lot of work you can do just to look at to what's around you. The other end of the telescope for it is also that particularly women, as well as people from other underrepresented groups, are not very good at putting themselves forward as mentors. So it does lend itself to a kind of certain personality type. So if someone says to you, we're looking for mentors, you might not put your name forward. So if you are in a position where you're doing okay, or you feel like you can offer something, it's very hard to say, and it feels a bit to put yourself out there and go, yeah, I'm brilliant, I should be somebody's mentor. So there's an element of that as well. And how do we cultivate environments where people, without sounding like they're full of themselves and they're egotistical, make it known that they would be happy to support somebody else. So it's there's an ickiness in both directions. Like, it's awkward for the person who wants some help and wants to be mentored, and there's some awkwardness for the mentor who would love to help somebody else on their coaching career but doesn't want to come across as a bit of an arse. And you know, there's like all of that is going on for everybody concerned, so it's not an easy thing. So really I would start with the map as an individual, thinking about, if I were looking for a mentor, let's do my map and see who within there might be interested in supporting me, and then approaching them for a conversation without it being overly burdensome. If you have extended connections to people in different environments, see if you can capitalize on that, and just make it known that you're looking for new opportunities to shadow or observe or develop. But equally, for people on the call, not to be afraid that you will have something to offer somebody else, and if that's something that you'd like to do, it's not a dirty thing to do. It's not a bad thing. You're not suddenly, I don't know, blowing your own trumpet or whatever other analogies you want to use. You know, that we all have something to offer, and it doesn't necessarily have to be hierarchical. So you could have a much more experienced coach who works in a community context mentoring somebody who's more junior but is in a talent context, because that particular relationship works. Not everybody needs to be mentored by the England head coach, because that person, it's like going on a dating app. That person isn't going to be right for everybody. You have to find the right fit for who you are and where you're going. So yeah, hopefully that made sense.
Yeah, I guess just to pull on your expertise, would it be beneficial to have two mentors, one within the sport and one without the sport? Because you sometimes get stuck within and channeled within your sport and your environment, and there's lots of learning to happen outside of the sport. So just wondered, that would be question number one. And question number two, do you feel the word mentor is a barrier to women both ways? And if so, how do you think it should be phrased to allow more women to step forward or go and access a mentor or a person of confidence and expertise, and not look like a sign of weakness that you're going to someone else for advice?
Yeah, so loads in there.
Sorry.
Yes, definitely multiple people, great idea. I think co-coaching, team coaching, whether that is coaching of participants or coaching of coaches, I think that should be more of a thing. I think if we could be more comfortable in the round of none of this landing all on one human being, and the idea that you could have as a participant, you could have a number of coaching voices supporting you, and then as a coach, I could have a number of supporting voices. And one of those people I might consider a mentor, i.e. he or she has trodden the path that I want to go. Someone else, I might consider them more as a coach, or so they're going to ask me lots of questions and stretch and pull me. So coach. That might be an interesting thing, you know, like executive coaching or coach developers. We recently worked with Open University to do a free online webinar module thing, which is called Coaching the Coaches, and it's worth checking out if you're interested in that, and it gives people skills to do that. But we intentionally didn't badge it up as mentoring or coach developer or anything like that. It's about supporting, it's about coaching others, coaching coaches. So it's, I do think there is a little bit of a rebranding, labeling thing that some people, and again, it's really hard to generalize. Some people don't mind being called a mentor. Other people, it doesn't sit very comfortably, and it's completely dependent on who you are and your personality. So, you know, it's a mix of having a mentor, having a sponsor, somebody who's going to give you opportunities and give you access to stuff and see you and have faith in you, and having a coach to ask you questions and stretch yourself and to get you to drive your own change. And all of those things may end up being one human being, or that could be 3 or 6 separate human beings, all who form part of your picture. I think often we look for like the unicorn person that is everything, and they're probably quite busy as well. So you have to factor in how often you want to talk to this person and their proximity to you. And yeah, it's complicated, but I don't think it's impossible to unpick if you know, to start and have some conversations.
Yeah, and I think the message is, isn't it, being clear on what you want to achieve from that, so you can then lay that message on to whoever you're approaching support, guidance from, and how that works, and maybe setting the parameters of how often you might want to touch base with that person. You know, some people might only want it yearly or twice yearly, and setting that expectation to create that relationship and allow it to flourish. I guess moving on, looking at some other areas that you mentioned within your article around mental health, poor relationships, the dedication that it does take to be a coach, and not everything's always positive. I guess, what advice would you give to female coaches out there in the handball community or the wider sporting setting about how to overcome them? You discussed, obviously, if you have an issue, you try and understand, reflect, and get to the root cause. It's a difficult sequence of steps you have to take to get to that point. And I just wondered if you've got any advice and guidance of how to get to that point and manage things that may go on as a female coach.
Yeah, so I think anything you can do to practice saying no. Practice saying no. That is a good thing. Practice saying no, and how you can create boundaries for yourselves rather than barriers for others. So you can't control what anybody else does. You can only control yourself. You can't control how anybody responds to you. You can only control yourself. And just really doing that work about how comfortable you feel about different things, and trying to unpick why. Like, there's a lot of work in reassuring yourself and being comfortable that not everybody's going to like you, and that's okay, but that is also not an excuse for not being very nice. So you have to balance those two trade-offs, being authentic but also meeting the needs of the people around you and being a good team player. And it's so complicated and so complex to unpick it all, but really it does come down to that being comfortable saying no, managing expectations, managing your own expectations, but also giving yourself some compassion that not everything will or can be perfect. You wouldn't expect an athlete to be perfect every time, and equally we need to take that tone when we talk about coaches. You are human. People talk about coaches needing to be vulnerable. I would say just be more comfortable being fallible, because you are, and that's fine. It's not about being vulnerable, it's just accepting that we're fallible human beings, and if you're trying, you're going to fail. So if you're really pushing yourself outside your comfort zone, at some point something's not going to work out quite the way you planned it. and that's all right. Pick yourself up, dust it off we go again, just like you would with an athlete. I think that would be my big takeaway. There's something about the inner voice. You'll have your own inner voice, and your inner voice sometimes talk to you in a way that you would never talk to anybody else, and that in itself is a reflection. If you're talking to yourself in a way that you would never use to talk to somebody else, then you need to figure that out, because we need to be our own cheerleaders a little bit. So I definitely think that there is pressure, and when you are maybe the only female in an environment, there's additional pressure, because you're not just representing yourself. You can feel like you're representing all the women coaches. You feel like you could have the world on your shoulders, but you haven't. And you just, the way you would talk to an athlete or a performer, try and have those conversations with coaches, and make sure you're doing it to each other as well. So like, it's about helping one another to have those conversations, and when things don't go to plan, figuring out and seeing if you can unpick it, and sometimes just chalk it up to experience, because it will go wrong, because if you're trying, you will at some point fall over.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that rings to your try, fail, reflect and go again mantra, that people need to try, and then they need to fail to get better, and that then comes back to that plan of where you need support. And if you don't fail, you'll never know where that support network needs to be, and where you need to potentially pick up a development or educational package that might help you, and in whatever form that is, whether that's coming from the national governing body, or it's coming from an outside source like a university or a very experienced coach. So yeah, definitely think that. I guess coming on, I want to leave some time for some questions. I guess, what are the top 3 things you'd like to see in the future for female coaches, whether that is on a general level or within a system level, really, whatever suits you, really?
So I think a big thing is that the dream world would be that women as coaches wasn't so much of a thing, and I'd probably echo that with other diversity characteristics. Like, the amount of coaches who've got a disability is absolutely tiny, and when you consider the amount of athletes who go to the Paralympics and things like that, there's not the transition rate into coaching professions, and that in itself is interesting, let alone a community space. But I would just want a broader diversity of people in coaching roles, because I do think that all these people bring so much to the environment. So I would want almost women as coaches just to be a thing, like not to be so much of a special side thing. It's just ordinary, and you'll have pictures of women coaching, and in order to do that, things like the way roles are constructed, the way that we recruit people, the way that we train people, and the kind of training that we offer in terms of the topics and the support, and whether you've got a coach developer or whatever it might be, all of those things are going to have to move and evolve. So in order to get to that place where we've got a broader diversity of people doing coaching, the other bits all need to move as well. So I guess that feeds into my it's way more than 3 things, but the development pathways would be multiple. So you could have all this prior learning and then move across, and you'd have a flexible journey in terms of how you learn. And we wouldn't just count learning as a workshop or a webinar, but we learn every day, and that idea that you're trying something and you fail, and that counts as a learning experience, and that you count it as a learning experience, and consider it and think about it, and that we help each other a bit more. And although there will be competition between coaches at different clubs, but the idea that there are bits of coaching which you could share best practice with. So you might not share tactics, you might not share training plans, but you could have a space where there's a conversation about coaching in the round and challenges, and that kind of a place where it just feels like a bit more of a coaching community. And maybe that's across sports, and maybe that's within sports, that it's a bit more of a supportive environment. Yeah, that definitely wasn't 3, was it?
No, but we'll go with it. I guess just pulling on some of those bits is absolutely fine. There's so much, isn't there? I guess as a a sector we put lots of female only courses on, and I just wondered what your view was on that, and whether that has an impact on the system, or it just creates an environment that's safe, and post those packages, products that we put on, how do we support them post that product, because it's a little bit of a false environment within that, and how we pull that development strand throughout. We create a bit of an environment that's not realistic, and then we put them back into their clubs or within the talent system. And I just wondered what your views were on that, really.
Yeah, so I think it's a bit of both. Like, for some people, women only spaces are what they would like, and for some people they go on to women only exit routes. But again, I think there's a lot we can learn from participation programs. So for example, you wouldn't get a lady in to do 6 weeks of back to netball, and then her only exit route into is like full on £300 a year competitive super serious netball, because that wouldn't match. So there's something about how do we match these different environments together, and thinking about why are we putting this on, where are those people going to go, and thinking about that a little bit more proactively up front, rather than putting on the course and then letting people out into the world to see where they go. I think there should be female only options, but it does sometimes, if you think you've got a female only course, you get all the women go on the female only course, that means there's even less women who go on the main course, and then the one woman who does go on the main course has an even stranger experience, because there's even fewer women than, and so I can see where it spirals. There's definitely a place for both, and it is thinking a little bit more carefully up front about where is the actual coaching happening. So the coaching course doesn't make you a coach. Like, that's a part of your journey. You become a coach when you start coaching, and you might have been coaching before you went on the course, or you might go on the course and then you might start coaching, but you're coaching then. Excuse me, loud noise outside.
No, sorry.
So that for me is just thinking about that. So a really good example with the Muslim Sports Association, and a lady there, Yasmin, and she started doing various different sports for her local community, and then was looking for a basketball coach but couldn't find a female basketball coach, so decided she was going to train up some basketball coaches, and because what she was offering in terms of the training, and she worked with the governing bodies to deliver these sessions, and she did one for football as well. She worked with them to bespoke the sessions, so it really met the needs of the women who wanted to attend these. And then they were also then going off into an environment which was kind of similar to the one they'd experienced on the course, in that the course was delivered over a series of evenings, and then when they were going out to do the coaching, that was going to be a series of evenings. Like, it just sort of made sense. So it's more about thinking about the read across of what is the training and what is the deployment, and how does that make sense. So yeah, that would be my advice there.
No, perfect. I guess just to wrap up, a bit of a personal question to you, about what your journey was as a female coach. You obviously got into the talent pathway, and I just wondered if there was any really golden nuggets of how you managed to do that, and what took you on that journey and made the difference potentially for you to carry on that journey, and keep developing, really.
I think I loved coaching, and I was curious to learn as much as I could from as many people as I possibly could. There's definitely an element of luck. Like, you have to work hard and be in a position so that when the opportunity presents itself, you're ready to go. And at the time, it doesn't necessarily feel like you're doing anything. So you're doing a lot of work. I did a lot of standing in the rain, hockey's outside. There's a lot of that, and sometimes you're not really sure why you're doing it, but you just kind of follow your heart, follow your nose. And then, if I'm entirely honest, I managed to land a job doing some talent pathway stuff that I did not think I was in any way qualified or appropriate to do, and it was such a steep learning curve, and I was probably absolutely terrible, and I remember having a really hard feedback from the centrally contracted coach, was the England hockey coach at the time, and going away from that and thinking, no, I've just got to learn more, I've got to do better, and applying applying to it like you would with a performer or an athlete. But there is definitely a huge heap of luck, and there's something about doing things which seem a bit lateral and aren't necessarily a linear journey, and being curious and doing the workout away from the court or the pitch, just to read or listen to podcasts or whatever else you can, and be really interested in coaching and in people, not necessarily just within your sport, because there's so much you can learn from everybody, and make as many connections as you can, and just go into things with an open heart and an open mind, and see what happens. It's not really tangible advice. It's like when people talk about your journey and you look backwards and it makes sense, but when you're in it looking forwards, it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever.
No, yeah, and I just wanted to ask that question really, because obviously some female people don't have that golden nugget or experience that constructive feedback that then drives them. So it's just interesting to know, especially, I guess it'd be even more interesting to explore the amount of people within talent pathways that it isn't their sport, but they played as a youngster and had that passion for, and how that changes that female development opportunity. And I do agree. I think the more coaches, whether female or male, you touch point with and experience and communicate and converse with, you do learn, and you learn a lot from it. It doesn't have to always be formal, and some of those smaller conversations can really be that turning point of how you view things and move forward. I think that's a great place to end. Thank you for that, Lucy. We've got a question in the chat box. If anyone else wants to pop any questions in the chat box, please do. We've got just short of 10 minutes to look at them. One of the coaches has put in, sometimes it's difficult to accept constructive feedback when generally only interviewed by men for performance roles. So how do you trust their feedback, and that there's not an agenda to that? And I think that's an important bit, I guess, if you can expand on about how we can change that if a system is very male dominated, how they can understand and be sympathetic to a female journey and what they've achieved without it being a threat.
Yeah, so I'd start probably with the coach. I saw the question come in and it made me smile, and I thought, I wonder if that feedback actually was constructive. So that's the first one. It's like some people don't give great feedback, so you might have not got great feedback and it might not have landed well because it wasn't very helpful. Equally, at the same token, you have to take what you can take. You can't change the decision, and there will be something in there that if it feels a bit uncomfortable, it may well be because it's close to the bone, and they're the hardest ones to look at, because sometimes things land and it hurts because you think, oh, and either that's because there's a little bit of a niggle that it might be correct, or that they've completely misinterpreted you and it makes you offended. So just have a look at why doesn't it sit well. There must be some bits from it you can take and you can work on. I think when you don't trust that there's another agenda, it also feeds into the idea that you're supposed to just take feedback and accept it. That's somebody's opinion. So there'll be bits in there which you can work on, and you need to be really, really honest with yourself, and take what you can take. But equally, at the same time, that's their view, and they're the people making the appointments at that time, and that's where it is. I think there's a bigger question about how do we get more female and more diverse panels for making these appointments to talk to that narrative, and how do we bring men on the journey and start to have these conversations with them about what a good performance coach looks like, and what that means in a broader sense, not just because of the inclusion of women. So there's another piece about, if you're a club running interviews, or you're a national governing body, how do you think about who constructs those interview panels, and being a bit more proactive about bringing in other voices, even if they're not necessarily technical experts, as well as how do you support those people making those decisions to understand a broader view of good coaching and what that means.
Perfect. And I think I was listening to a podcast you did earlier about sometimes females are not viewed as technical, tactical experts, and sometimes that's how the panel is driving the agenda, maybe, you know, within a specific sport. And I guess, what would your advice be that if you are applying for a job and you know that the technical, tactical aspect is a priority, but you may not have that? How do you present that to even get through the preliminary stages of that interview to then showcase yourself in front of that panel?
Yeah, so you mean that you feel like you're worried that your tactical and technical expertise isn't at the level that they're looking for, yeah, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I think for a lot of females, we probably on paper, the characteristics of being person-centered, getting to know your participants, those sort of things are maybe what is attached to female coaching, and the male gender stereotype might be that they're very in the sport knowledge.
Yeah.
And how do you change that perception and get across that, you know, you may have done lots of informal learning
to
support that, but it might not show on a piece of paper that you're submitting. It might not get you through that first stage of check boxes, really.
Yeah, so I would go down that route of, you need to write down what you have done, who are you, what do you believe, what have you achieved, how do you do that. I don't think that CPD you should lead with. I think you need to lead with your applications about who you are and what is your coaching philosophy and what do you view your successes as. I don't know if I can swear on this, but I wouldn't bullshit, but equally don't put yourself down, don't do yourself a disservice, because you need to talk positively, you need to talk yourself up and be confident in what you have to say. There's a challenge where we recruit often in sport based on CV, so the people with the longest CVs get longer CVs, and that just carries on. So there is something about how do you lead with your strengths, how do you lead with your definition, your philosophy, what you have achieved, some tangible outcomes, and they don't have to be winning everything. That could be progressing. How can you get testimonials or case studies? Who can speak highly of you, who's well regarded, who can talk to that? And how do you not undermine yourself if you're worried about your technical and tactical knowledge? Being honest enough to say that you want to work on the area, but without doing yourself down. It's tough.
Perfect, thanks. We've got another question from a coach that interestingly has called herself a novice handball coach, which I guess that's a whole different discussion about how we brand ourselves, and maybe starting the journey would be a better choice of words. And she's asking what resources you'd recommend. Is there some go-to webinars, podcasts? It might be people that are funded in this area, and it might not even be sport-based, about female development as a person. So I just wondered, do you have any thoughts on that? Obviously it's a bit on the spot, so
yeah. So I just put 2 in the chats there. So I Coach Kids EU is a really cool resource, worth looking up. It's a consortium of people, but led by Leeds Beckett University, and it's all about children's coaching and how to be a brilliant children's coach. Lots of advice, and they have their own podcast as well. So that's quite interesting, just about coaching in general. There's also another website called Boying Kids, and they basically do play-based games. They have on their website 100 free warm-up games, all really fun and really adaptable to like any sport really. And they are running as well a series of train the trainer courses. So it's really cool. That came out of Oxford Brookes University and some sports studies students there who designed all of those. So they would be sort of sporty, fun play angles that would be really useful. And I absolutely love like the warm-up games, particularly if you want to pretend to be a crocodile or a badger or something. That's that kind of flavour. It's really, really good, really fun. I think more generally, there's a podcast I really like called How to Own the Room, which is all about women and the art of brilliant speaking, and it's more about women as leaders and as voices, and your presence as a person, which I think is good. There are endless podcasts about constraints-led approach or games-based training, which you can Google if that's your thing, and you want to go down more into that stuff. And I'll send over some links to share. But yeah, they would be high on my list at the moment.
Amazing. I guess just to summarize, I think we're very on the same point of that formal education has a place, but that other learning is really important to propel you and making the right connections to achieve the success that you want to achieve as a female coach. And I think from listening to you and the conversations that I've had, is it's really important to check back in. You may set yourself as what success looks like, and I think if you put yourself in a position that you constantly come back and check that and look at the impact you've had, it may take you in the way of developing in a different way and reflecting on what you've done, what you've achieved, where you want to go, because you may set a path out and it might not be there, and other opportunities come. And maybe the message we need to get out there is don't discount those things that might not be on that linear path that you set out originally, because they might bring some really good learning opportunities and development and networking that might propel you to a different level and to look at things differently. I guess just to wrap up, thank you ever so much. I'm sure people can find you on Twitter and LinkedIn. If people want to get in contact, would that is all right, Lucy, that we're on the call? And yeah, I think it's great to have this conversation, and I think Lucy's highlighted not on just this workshop but on other workshops and podcasts you've done is that it's a massive area, and an area that really needs to be put under the telescope and looked at for a range of reasons. But feel proud of what you achieve as a female, and the more you can put your hand up and say you have achieved something, whatever that is, big or small, blow that trumpet as loud as you can. You will totally change maybe the perceptions people have. People can watch you coach in certain situations and make a viewpoint, and opinions are always able to be changed and redirected. And I think I can only thank you for coming and speaking to us and giving us your pearls of wisdom and really starting this conversation, because I think it's enabled me to start having conversations within the sport that maybe we never would have. And I welcome anyone on the call to contact me and discuss further if they want. And I'd just like to thank you, people that have come, and have a good afternoon and a good weekend. Thank you all. And hopefully see you on the next workshop.
Cheers, everybody.
Thank you.
Hey, Miriam.